Gentlemen, you were given to understand that for some years past I have been doing myself the paternal pleasure of telling my grandchildren the history of France. And you ask if I have any intention of publishing these family studies of our country's grand life. I have no such idea at the outset. I had no such idea at the outset. It was of my grandchildren and of them alone that I was thinking. What I had at heart was to make them really comprehend our history and to interest them in it by doing justice to their understanding and, at the same time, to their imagination, by setting it before them clearly and, at the same time, to the life. Every history, and especially that of France, is one vast, long drama in which events are linked together according to defined laws, and in which the actors play parts not ready-made and learned by heart. Parts depending, in fact, not only upon the accidents of their birth, but also upon their own ideas and their own will. There are in the history of peoples two sets of causes essentially different and at the same time closely connected: the natural causes, which are set over the general course of events, and the unrestricted causes, which are incidental. Men do not make the whole of history. It has laws of higher origin. But in history, men are unrestricted agents who produce for it results and exercise over it an influence for which they are responsible. The fated causes and the unrestricted causes, the defined laws of events and the spontaneous actions of man's free agency. Herein is the whole of history. And in the faithful reproduction of these two elements consist the truth and the moral of stories from it. Never was I more struck with this twofold character of history than in my tales to my grandchildren. When I commenced these lessons with them, they, beforehand, evinced a lively interest, and they began to listen to me with serious goodwill. But when they did not well apprehend the lengthening chain of events, or when historical personages did not become, in their eyes, creatures, real and free, worthy of sympathy or reprobation, when the drama was not developed before them with clearness and animation, I saw their attention grow fitful and flagging. They required light and life together. They wished to be illumined and excited, instructed and amused. At the same time that the difficulty of satisfying this twofold desire was painfully felt by me, I discovered therein more means and chances than I had at first foreseen of succeeding in making my young audience comprehend the history of France in its complication and its grandeur. When Corneille observed, "In the well-born soul, valor ne'er lingers till due seasons roll," he spoke as truly for intelligence as for valor. When once awakened and really attentive, young minds are more earnest and more capable of complete comprehension than anyone would suppose. In order to explain fully to my grandchildren the connection of events and the influence of historical personages, I was sometimes led into very comprehensive considerations and into pretty deep studies of character. And in such cases I was nearly always not only perfectly understood, but keenly appreciated. I put it to the proof in the sketch of Charlemagne's reign and character. And the two great objects of that great man, who succeeded in one and failed in the other, received from my youthful audience the most riveted attention and the most clear comprehension. Youthful minds have greater grasp than one is disposed to give them credit for. And perhaps men would do well to be as earnest in their lives as children are in their studies. In order to attain the end I had set before me, I always took care to connect my stories or my reflections with the great events or the great personages of history. When we wish to examine and describe a district scientifically, we traverse it in all its divisions and in every direction. We visit plains as well as mountains. villages as well as cities, the most obscure corners as well as the most famous spots. This is the way of proceeding with the geologist, the botanist, the archaeologist, the statistician, the scholar. But when we wish particularly to get an idea of the chief features of a country, its fixed outlines, its general conformation, its special aspects, its great roads, we mount the heights. We place ourselves at points whence we can best take in the totality and the physiognomy of the landscape. And so we must proceed in history, when we wish neither to reduce it to the skeleton of an abridgment, nor extend it to the huge dimensions of a learned work. Great events and great men are the fixed points and the peaks of history, and it is thence that we can observe it in its totality and follow it along its highways. In my tales to my grandchildren, I sometimes lingered over some particular anecdote which gave me an opportunity of setting in a vivid light the dominant spirit of an age or the characteristic manners of a people. But with rare exceptions, it is always on the great deeds and the great personages of history that I have relied for making of them in my tales what they were in reality, the center and the focus of the life of France. At the outset, in giving these lessons, I took merely short notes of dates and proper names, when I had reason given me to believe that they might be of some service and interest to other children than my own, and even, I was told, to others besides children. I undertook to put them down in the form in which I had developed them to my youthful audience. I will send you, gentlemen, some portions of the work, and if it really appears to you advisable to enlarge the circle for which it was originally intended, I will most gladly entrust to you the care of its publication. Accept, gentlemen, the assurance of my most distinguished sentiments. Guissot, Val Richer, December 1869. Young France inhabits a country, long ago civilized and Christianized, where, despite of much imperfection and much social misery, 38 millions of men live in security and peace, under laws equal for all, and efficiently upheld. There is every reason to nourish great hopes of such a country, and to wish for it more and more of freedom, glory, and prosperity. But one must be just towards one's own times, and estimate at their true value advantages already acquired, and progress already accomplished. If one were suddenly carried 20 or 30 centuries backward, into the midst of that which was then called Gaul, one would not recognize France. The same mountains reared their heads, the same plains stretched far and wide, the same rivers rolled on their course. There is no alteration in the physical formation of the country, but its aspect was very different. Instead of the fields all trim with cultivation and all covered with various produce, one would see inaccessible morasses and vast forests as yet uncleared, given up to the chances of primitive vegetation, peopled with wolves and bears, and even the urus, or huge wild ox, and with elks too, a kind of beast that one finds no longer nowadays, save in the colder regions of northeastern Europe, such as Lithuania or Courland. Then wandered over the Champagne great herds of swine, as fierce almost as wolves, tamed only so far as to know the sound of their keeper's horn. The better sort of fruits and of vegetables were quite unknown. They were imported into Gaul, the greatest part from Asia, a portion from Africa and the islands of the Mediterranean, and others, at a later period, from the New World. Cold and rough was the prevailing temperature. Nearly every winter the rivers froze sufficiently hard for the passage of cars, and 3 or 4 centuries before the Christian era, on that vast territory comprised between the ocean, the Pyrenees, the Mediterranean, the Alps, and the Rhine, lived 6 or 7 millions of men, a bestial life, enclosed in dwellings dark and low, the best of them built of wood and clay, covered with branches or straw, made in a single round piece, open to daylight by the door alone, and confusedly heaped together behind a rampart, not inartistically composed of timber, earth, and stone, which surrounded and protected what they were pleased to call a town. Of even such towns there were scarcely any as yet, save in the most populous and least uncultivated portions of Gaul. That is to say, in the southern and eastern regions at the foot of the mountains of Auvergne and the Cevennes, and along the coasts of the Mediterranean. In the north and the west were paltry hamlets, as transferable almost as the people themselves, and on some islet amidst the morasses, or in some hidden recess of the forest, were huge entrenchments formed of the trees that were felled, where the population, at the first sound of the war cry, ran to shelter themselves, with their flocks and all their movables. And the war cry was often heard. Men living grossly and idly are very prone to quarrel and fight. Gaul, moreover, was not occupied by one and the same nation, with the same traditions and the same chiefs. Tribes, very different in origin, habits, and date of settlement, were continually disputing the territory. In the south were Iberians or Aquitanian, Phoenicians, and Greeks. In the north and northwest, Kymrians or Belgians. Everywhere else, Gauls or Celts, the most numerous settlers, who had the honor of giving their name to the country. Who were the first to come then, and what was the date of the first settlement? Nobody knows. Of the Greeks alone does history mark with any precision the arrival in southern Gaul. The Phoenicians preceded them by several centuries, but it is impossible to fix any exact time. The information is equally vague about the period when the Kymrians invaded the north of Gaul. As for the Gauls and the Iberians, there is not a word about their first entrance into the country, for they are discovered there already at the first appearance of the country, itself in the domain of history. The Iberians, whom Roman writers call Aquitanians, dwelt at the foot of the Pyrenees, in the territory comprised between the mountains, the Garonne, and the ocean. They belonged to the race which, under the same appellation, had peopled Spain, but by what route they came into Gaul is a problem which we cannot solve. It is much the same in tracing the origin of every nation, for in those barbarous times men lived and died without leaving any enduring memorial of their deeds and their destinies, no monuments, no writings, just a few oral traditions, perhaps, which are speedily lost or altered. It is in proportion as they became enlightened and civilized that men feel the desire and discover the means of extending their memorial far beyond their own lifetime. That is the beginning of history, the offspring of noble and useful sentiments which cause the mind to dwell upon the future and to yearn for long continuance, sentiments which testified to the superiority of man over all other creatures living upon our earth, which foreshadow the immortality of the soul, and which are warrant for the progress of the human race, by preserving for the generations to come what has been done and learned by the generations that disappear. By whatever route and at whatever epoch the Iberians came into the southwest of Gaul, they abide there still in the department of the Lower Pyrenees under the name of Basques, a peoplet, peuplade from people, or the analogy of circlet from circle. Distinct from all its neighbors in features, costume, and especially language, which resembles none of the present languages of Europe, contains many words which are to be found in the names of rivers, mountains, and towns of olden Spain, and which presents a considerable analogy to the idioms, ancient and modern, of certain peoples of northern Africa. The Phoenicians did not leave, as the Iberians did, in the south of France, distinct and well authenticated descendants. They had begun about 1100 BC to trade there. They went thither in search of furs and gold and silver, which were got either from the sand of certain rivers, as for instance the Ariege, in Latin Aurigera, or from certain mines of the Alps, the Cevennes, and the Pyrenees. They brought in exchange stuffs dyed with purple, necklaces and rings of glass, and above all, arms and wine, a trade like that which is nowadays carried on by the civilized peoples of Europe with the savage tribes of Africa and America. For the purpose of extending and securing their commercial expeditions, the Phoenicians founded colonies in several parts of Gaul, and to them is attributed the earliest origin of Nemausus, Nîmes, and of Alesia, near Semur. But at the end of 3 or 4 centuries, these colonies fell into decay. The trade of the Phoenicians was withdrawn from Gaul, and the only important sign it preserved of their residence was a road which, starting from the eastern Pyrenees, skirted the Gaelic portion of the Mediterranean, crossed the Alps by the pass of Tenda, and so united Spain, Gaul, and Italy. After the withdrawal of the Phoenicians, this road was kept up and repaired at first by the Greeks of Marseille and subsequently by the Romans. As merchants and colonists, the Greeks were, in Gaul, the successors of the Phoenicians, and Marseille was one of their first and most considerable colonies. At the time of the Phoenicians' decay in Gaul, a Greek peoplet, the Rhodians, had pushed their commercial enterprises to a great distance, and, in the words of the ancient historians, held the empire of the sea. Their ancestors had, in former times, succeeded the Phoenicians in the island of Rhodes, and they likewise succeeded them in the south of Gaul, and founded at the mouth of the Rhone a colony called Rhodanusia, or Rhoda, with the same name as that which they had already founded on the northeast coast of Spain, and which is nowadays the town of Rosas in Catalonia. But the importance of the Rhodians on the southern coast of Gaul was short-lived. It had already sunk very low in the year 600 BC, when Euxenes, a Greek trader coming from Phocaea, an Ionian town of Asia Minor, to seek his fortune, landed from a bay eastward of the Rhone. The Segobrigians, a tribe of the Gaelic race, were in occupation of the neighboring country. Nan, their chief, gave the strangers kindly welcome, and took them home with him to a great feast which he was giving for his daughter's marriage, who was called Gyptis, according to some, and Beta according to other historians. A custom which exists still in several cantons of the Basque country, and even at the center of France, in Morvan, a mountainous district of the department of Nièvre, would that the maiden should appear only at the end of the banquet and holding in her hand a filled wine cup, and that the guest to whom she should present it should become the husband of her choice. By accident or quite another cause, say the ancient legends, Gyptis stopped opposite Euxenes and handed him the cup. Great was the surprise and probably anger amongst the Gauls who were present, but Nan, believing he recognized a commandment from his gods, accepted the Phocaean as his son-in-law, and gave him as dowry the bay where he had landed, with some cantons of the territory around. Euxenes, in gratitude, gave his wife the Greek name of Aristosina, that is, the best of hostesses. Sent away his ship to Phocaea for colonists, and whilst waiting for them, laid in the center of the bay, on a peninsula hollowed out harbor-wise towards the south, the foundations of a town which he called Massilia, then Marseille. Scarcely a year had elapsed when Euxenes' ship arrived from Phocaea, and with it several galleys bringing colonists full of hope. and laden with provisions, utensils, arms, seeds, vine cuttings, and olive cuttings, and moreover a statue of Diana, which the colonists had gone to fetch from the celebrated temple of that goddess at Ephesus, and which her priestess Aristarche accompanied to its new country.